This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Before my guest today, a quick reminder, finally, the audiobook of Trend Following, How to Make a Fortune in Bull, Bear, and Black Swan Markets is out now in audiobook. 34 plus hours. Check it out. My guest today is Chris Fussell. He is a managing partner in the McChrystal Group and the leader of the McChrystal Group Leadership Institute. You might recall that Stanley McChrystal is a retired United States Army general, best known for his command of Joint Special Operations Command in the mid-2000s. Starting in Iraq, Chris had the opportunity to be right alongside Stanley McChrystal. And all those years later, two great books have unfolded. His first book, Team of Teams, New Rules of Engagement for a Complex World, written with Stanley McChrystal. His newest book, One Mission, How Leaders Build a Team of Teams. I always want to know, because I've not been in the military, I always want to know, how can military lessons, beyond the obvious Sun Tzu art of war, how can military lessons, especially the lessons that are coming in today in the modern world, help us all in our business? Chris Fussell has answers, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. I had the chance to meet one guy, a really interesting guy. I didn't know what the hell he did for a long time. He lived in downtown San Diego. He was built like a blank shit house. He was a big guy, but he was very low key. And, after maybe like a year or so, he kind of, he said what he did, but that was about it. There was never any details. But the interesting thing about meeting him, and he is a SEAL, still active, is that he didn't talk the details. But just his presence was inspiring. There was something about him, I still can't put my finger on it. There was this quiet confidence where you just said, you know what? I like being around him. I feel better. I feel more productive. I feel cleaner, is actually the word I almost think. You know this feeling when I'm talking about it, but it's hard to translate to folks that have not walked your walk. What happens to you guys when you get inside the program early on? And I would love for you to paint the picture. Here you are, you're an officer, but you enter SEAL training. Paint that picture very early. What starts to happen in some of those first aha moments?
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to look at it. In some ways, you're asking sort of the nature nurture question. So there's lots of ways we could tackle this, but I'll throw out some thoughts and we could go back and forth a little bit. I think one thing that's interesting about most of the special operations communities, this isn't just limited to the SEAL teams where I spent my career, I would say that they don't select as much as they down select. And so by that, they'll let in people that have met certain standards around sort of physical, you have to have a clean background, those sorts of things, go through a couple interviews. But then you get into the program, and the program is really good at down selecting of the 150 people that start a SEAL selection class. In 6, 7, 8 months, there'll be 25 of them left. And that top bracket, the folks that don't make it are often solid people, good citizens, still going to have great military careers. But there's a component that they're selecting away, that you try to use pretty rigorous training over a long period of time to find out, I think, to point some of the characteristics that you identify, who has that innate ability to triage a situation very quickly. What's critical, what's nice to have, and what doesn't matter, even though in the moment they all might seem mixed together. How can I sort of steel my nerves against what, seeming pressure in a training environment versus what absolutely has to happen if we're going to succeed as a class in this sort of next evolution we're going through when we're going through the basic SEAL training. Those are the sorts of characteristics that I believe end up creating the sort of personality that you described. And that's the initial sort of selection window that we'll put folks through. So you're looking for those inherent characteristics. And then obviously in today's environment with the stress levels that have been going on inside the military for well over a decade now, constant deployments to combat theaters, etc., those sort of nature level skills are then nurtured in a very intense environment. I think that, and they just accelerate. And so I think when you meet a seasoned person, be it in the SEAL teams or other parts of special operations or in the broader military that have been through these sort of pressure cookers for so many years, you sort of, they have this charismatic sense of calm and stability, and you're comfortable in an uncertain environment with him because whoever that guy was that you met, he's probably been in a lot of life or death uncertain situations. That just refines those inherent skills that I think the initial parts of the program naturally find and select for, and then he's grown them over what was probably a very intense career overseas in different conflict zones.
Let me connect this to something disparate. Major League Baseball. Last night, Major League Baseball, not such a big deal as the NFL and the NBA, but they had the Major League Baseball draft. I'm curious from the standpoint that the cream rises to the top, as you described, and very good people are let go. On the Major League Baseball diamond, everyone kind of knows, gosh, that guy's got it, and that guy is just a step behind. Is it that clean a distinction for you guys to where you get to the point you've crossed the threshold and you can see what you're bringing and what another guy is bringing? And this isn't about trying to brag or anything, but it's literally making that distinction, not unlike one would make on any professional athlete on the field.
I look at that through two different lenses. One being in the earlier selection years where you're just sort of your raw material trying to make it into the program. And then we can look at it once someone's in the community. I think in the early stages, it's actually very hard to tell. In any given, so our basic training there out in San Diego that you may have seen when you lived out there, BUDS training, basic underwater demolition, SEAL training, which goes back, many decades at this point. That training, it's very hard to look at a potential class on day one of 150 students and say, those are the 25 that are going to make it. It doesn't matter how long you've been in the community. There will be, a young college grad swimmer who just finished an Ironman who doesn't make it through Hell Week, one of the early real, gates. And then there'll be just a hard-nosed kid from Iowa who's never seen the ocean before who makes it through. And so it's really hard there's that innate inner quality and drive that pushes people to make it through. So I don't think because unlike a professional draft, you don't have this track record of performance. We're going to assume here are the basic gates to get into the program, and then we're going to let the training speak for itself. Now, once folks are into the community, fast forwarding, it took me maybe another 4, 5, 6 years before you're actually a value-added member of the community. It takes a long time to really develop some skills to bring to the team. Then when you get to the higher levels of small teams, very specific elements inside the community, you can start to see that, absolutely. I mean, and part of that's just because it's small. You know each other so well. And I always found the best operators that I worked with had really high levels of self-awareness. So not everybody can be everything, right? And so the best operators were the ones that said, hey, here are my you didn't have to talk about it. You just knew it intuitively. You could watch people operate. Here are the things that I'm strongest at, and here are my gaps. So when we build up a team, we're going to shore up those blank areas with each other. And so a good team in this environment, just like in sports, truly is more than the sum of its parts. So it's nonlinear. When you put together a good team with the right personalities and they understand how to complement each other's gaps and they know how to leverage each other's strengths, then you get something that's orders of magnitude better than it would be in just this person plus this person sort of fashion.
I'm going to take you into one mission in a moment, and I'm going to take you specifically to the year 2004, which I think is a pretty relevant year for you. I have one kind of building block question still before we advance, which is, you've got so much experience in talking to, quote, civilians like me, right? So you've talked to a lot of bright people outside of your realm. But of course, in your realm, there have been very unique experiences, lessons that translate, and a lot of this is about both of your books, but I'm looking for, from your perspective over the years, talking to us civilians, what is maybe a couple of the big picture lessons that are, just endemic to SEAL special operators, where the average could be a freaking hedge fund manager, it could be someone in Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley, where that person listens to you and they hear something and they go, wow, that just struck me. From your perspective, what are those aha moments that for sure cause people outside of your world to stand up and pay notice and go, man, I just took something away from me that's going to stick with me for the rest of my life?
It's always hard to put yourself in someone else's view, how they see those sorts of conversations. But I've been out of the service now for about 5 years, and so I've seen both sides of the fence. I would umbrella this whole comment by saying there are many more similarities between, and this was not intuitive to me coming out of the service. There are many more similarities between high performance teams in the military and high performance portions of civilian organizations, or high performance civilian organizations in general. The intensity, the drive and passion of individuals, the work that it takes to get there, all create these very, very similar cultures, albeit the end states can be radically different. That's sort of an umbrella comment. I would say that specific weapons that maybe wake people up. One is that the best special operations teams are those, a little bit like we were just talking about, that really create a selfless sort of culture where you see a group of, just superhero sort of operators, and they're just amazing folks at what they can do and what they've trained to do on the battlefield. But they really are putting others in the team ahead of themselves at all times. These are hyper competitive individuals that have spent their life, grew up in athletics, grew up in very intense environments, went into the most intense selection pipelines that they could find to get to this level. And then when they get there, when you walk around, you'd expect just a bunch of, hard charging, me focused professionals. Instead, they're often the most humble point in their career, where they realize my gift is to identify with the other members of my unit and bring them up, and they're doing the same for me. And so that sort of cross connection and really putting others ahead of yourself, it really is there's a sense of selflessness and humility that underpins these units, which I think is massively transferable over to other spaces, and often I think sets people back a little bit, because that's not what they would expect to see inside of these units. And some of that's just the way the media portrays it, and movies like to portray those sorts of environments. But if you look at a small group of traders on a floor, or, a fund that everybody's chasing down, hyper competitive deals, if you can flip their mindset and get them to say, hey, you've won, man. This is the Super Bowl. You are playing with the All-American pros here. If you all can collectively flip your mindset and start supporting each other as a high performance team, the competition will be orders of magnitude behind you. That's a huge one, I think, that carries across. The other piece I would say broadly, and again, this sort of speaks to connections between the just high performance driven individuals in general, is that there is the folks that can get into that environment. So back in the special operations world, sustain the level of operation, deal with all the second order effects that come with that sort of lifestyle. These aren't robots. There's no cyborg machine that spits out special operators. These are real people, and they grew up in towns across America. They have parents who love them. They have spouses and kids. They have mortgages. They have all the same stressors that anyone else has, right? Except theirs is coupled with deploying into combat zones on a pretty consistent basis, losing friends, dealing with the realities of war, both forward and bringing that home, right? So that's sort of the one differentiator, but everything else is the same. I mean, you get home from deployment and there's a stack of bills sitting on your table, and you got to sit down with your spouse and figure things out for the next few months, and then you redeploy. The folks that can live that life at a high peak performance level for years, they come up with some sort of what I think of as sort of their own personal cocktail on how they deal with it. How often do I need to work out? How much rest do I need? What's my diet look like? What is my spiritual or creative or metaphysical outlet that lets my mind go in other safer directions? How do I manage my relationship with my spouse and my kids? How do I focus on my professional requirements and continue to advance there?
Can I add one really quick? I used to watch this for my residence in San Diego. Or how do you land on second base at Petco Park in downtown San Diego?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, you've got these...
I saw that one all the time. That was great.
The leapfrogs coming in, right? Our skydiving team. Yeah. So these amazing requirements, and so I think there's a tendency in our society, especially today, because special operations have gotten so much coverage in their movies and media, etc. But there's still not, I don't think, a deep understanding of who these people are. They are people just like everybody else. They have certain level of physical capability, a certain level of mental resilience and ability to compartmentalize and triage stress, but their lives are just like everyone else's. And a message that I'll often work with in civilian space with senior leaders there around is, look, you have to figure out what your cocktail looks like. If you're aces at work and your family's falling apart, you're not going to be aces at work very long. And if you are, and you lose your family, in a few years, you're going to regret that. You're going to be miserable. Your life is not about one single thing. So you have to, if you want to be able to sustain this and truly be a leader amongst other high performers, you have to balance yourself out. If you're 40 pounds overweight and smoking a pack a day, you might be making a lot of money and moving up the chain, but that's going to catch up with you, right? So we all know this intuitively, but I think the best leaders have a real sense of discipline around creating this balance. I'm not a big believer in this sort of work-life balance sort of thing. I think it's all integrated, but you have to figure out what your personal cocktail looks like if you're going to be able to sustain that performance over time.
You mentioned charismatic, and of course my example was just one individual, but you didn't seem to blink at my descriptions. I was giving you a description, and you said, well, gosh, Mike is clearly talking about charisma. And it's interesting because that, you've got the interior perspective that is something that you're essentially saying to me and the audience that, Mike, that might not necessarily be so unique if you had the chance to interact with more operators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think, I think charisma is a really interesting and sometimes loaded word. I believe in charisma. I think the right person with the right sort of background and skill set in an environment that's ready to receive that personality. Charisma is sort of a sixth sense, and I think we've all been around it in different environments. But if you transfer it in another space, it can drift off, right? So there's a time and sort of environment aspect that's critical to that. But yeah, and I think especially in the special operations community, you get a critical mass of the right type of personality that's been pulled through that sort of training and selection, and you put them in the pressure cooker, then over time you see more and more of that sort of personality start to develop and emerge. I truly believe it.
Let me move you to our main topic of today, one mission. Let me take you to 2004. This is Iraq War. And a lot of things happened there, but from your perspective, I would love for you to outline for the audience what operators expected when they got to Iraq and what they were confronted with. And I would love, and I've heard some other presentations, I've heard you and Stanley McChrystal talk some, but I would love for you to kind of really give us an on-the-ground perspective that, you're getting there on the ground, you've got a certain bit of training, a certain style of training technique that you're going to deploy. But once you got to Iraq, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but all bets are off. I mean, things were different. Can you describe some of those tangible differences for people when you immediately got there and saw things, and how the fixes and the adjustments started to be made? And feel free also as well to add in that, of course, the military is always constrained by politics. So I imagine there was probably some moments in time, even early on in Iraq, where perhaps the folks on the front lines instinctively knew what to do, but perhaps were beholden to political calculation, which could take who knows how long. I'm just reading into it a little bit. I'm going to let you run with that and let you set the stage.
So 2004, I was, this is really the early first year or so of the conflict conflict in Iraq, which is where a lot of these lessons eventually came from. But as Iraq started to turn into a real quagmire there for several years. I was a young officer at that point. I was 7 years or so into my career in the military, and we'd done little things. I'd been around the world a bit, but this was the first full theater scale conflict. We were going to deploy, tens of thousands of troops into a conflict zone. Then I think part of me, and this isn't unlike I think somebody stepping in industry as a young professional, you think because the company's been around a while, you think that there's that it's that it must exist, right? That it's always been there and always will be there, and you're just a visitor. It takes you a while in your professional career, I think, to realize, no, it's just a group of people, and they're every day. It doesn't matter if they're the CEO or the most junior hire. They're all sort of trying to figure out how it works, trying to read the market, trying to connect with each other, trying to make things happen. Well, wars, I started to realize, the big military, I guess my big miss coming into this was that same assumption. There's going to be senior leaders and there's just a plan. These things just happen. We've done them before, and you sort of have this idea that it's all going to be set and running and you're just going to plug into it. Well, that's not the case. I mean, these are not unlike industry, but even more mysterious because you don't know the environment, you don't know the market, and there's the other team has a whole different set of rules, and they're trying to kill your side. I mean, it's a completely dynamic environment where leaders are just trying to figure out what it looks like. So that was miss one, was assuming I'm plugging into some sort of stable big thing. And the realization with that, I think, also once you start to understand that, then you realize I have to be a proactive player. I have to be an active thinker, listener, etc. if I'm going to add any sort of value to this problem set that we're all facing here collectively. So that's kind of one thing that I think is eye-opening when you get into any of this environment.
Chris, could you paint some color there and maybe let the audience feel something exactly that the enemy was doing that caused even yourself and folks above you to pause, or to cause the entire operation to pause because of what the enemy was doing?
Yeah, so when this started to really hit home for me that this was a different type of conflict was actually probably later than our senior leadership was piecing it together. But I remember in my first sort of mid-level tour as an operations officer, sort of mid-management, I was in Iraq, and I go into this particular scene in a little bit in one mission, and I remember sitting in our operations center, which, the screens all up on the wall with video feeds of operations going on the ground. You've got different units moving all over the place. To that point, my earlier tours, I'd been sort of in outstations with those teams out in the field, et cetera, which is fun and interesting and intense, et cetera. But I know I had a very sort of limited view based on where I was and the missions we were tasked with, those sorts of things. So now I'm up one level trying to see multiple parts of this, right? And we sent a unit out one day on what was just, sort of as normal of a mission as anything else. It was a daytime operation into a spot on the outskirts of Ramadi, a really intense city a few hours west of Baghdad in Iraq. And at that point, Ramadi was, one of the worst places on earth, just overrun with Al-Qaeda insurgents, etc. The operation went great. Team went in, they hit a building, they get back on their helicopters, they're coming back to base. And we had these overhead collection assets with camera feeds coming back to the headquarters. So we leave one of these aircraft over top of this target, and our operators are long gone, their helicopters are up and leaving. And it's daytime, so you can kind of see the whole neighborhood. So the whole neighborhood had gone quiet. It was an overrun insurgent area. And they knew there's something going on down the street because they heard fighters there. And so everybody sort of hunkered low. The gunfight ends, the operators leave, things are quiet. And then a few minutes later, we see a vehicle show up. A few minutes later, another vehicle shows up. People get out, they're walking around the courtyard, getting on phones. You can kind of see all this a little bit from overhead. It's grainy, but you can tell what's going on. Within 15 minutes, there's 6 vehicles, 30 people. Then the streets are full. Then the people, you're trying to track what's going on and make some sense of it. They're running into the crowd's coming into the building. They're running around the building. You can just tell it seems like mayhem, but it's not a riot. It's individuals running all over the place and trying to piece together what just happened. Then vehicles start taking off, moving all over the city. Some start heading into Baghdad. Some are heading north to other havens for Al-Qaeda. And that was a real moment for me when I realized when I was at the one level down, you saw this one individual problem set or target. And suddenly you can see literally in real time, this is a connected group of people all across this country. And so the fact that our operators aren't even back to base yet, they are reconnecting themselves and sharing information. I haven't even talked to our team about what they just saw. These guys are talking across the entire country, probably across the entire globe, about what just happened. And they're restructuring themselves, and they are reorienting to what their next actions are going to be based on what we just did. And we're more equipped, we're more talented, we have better operators, we have every advantage, but we don't have that. We are not connected and passing information across all boundaries at the rate that I can literally see them doing. That was a moment for me when I realized I personally am one step behind in a communication fight. Not on the tactical level, we have got all those advantages stacked in our favor. But when it comes to what I'm seeing them do right now, we're not set up for that. Now, luckily, our senior leadership was already pushing that down and down and down into the organization. So eventually I would wake up and catch up to how they were doing business. But it took some of us a little while, I know personally a while, to realize, that's why this is so critical, because it doesn't matter how well equipped they are, we have a new type of enemy that can connect and reshape itself constantly based on not what they want to do, but based on what we're doing to them.
That had to have been daunting when you first realized that.
It was, because then you step back, and I think that level of sort of angst that we felt then, or now I felt then, is similar to what you see now in some parts of industry, where you realize, gosh, everything I've learned as far as managing this organization, it's no longer applicable. Like, I've learned this really great playbook, and now we've got a threat. They don't have a playbook, and they don't need a playbook. And my playbook was based on understanding how we thought enemies like this would react. Well, they're not doing that. They're doing their own thing.
Let me give you one really quick that I just saw in corporate America. Obviously, we know that Amazon is taking off in a way that nobody could predict, right? The stock price went nowhere forever, but all of a sudden, Jeff Bezos is one of the richest men in the world. The company is just insanely powerful and successful. But there is still a Walmart. I saw the other day that Walmart is going to ask their employees after work to potentially start delivering packages. Now, that seems as aggressive a response as one could. That's like the kind of thing you would never expect to hear. Now, I don't know if it'll be successful, but it sounds very aggressive.
It's a senior leader. Bezos was obviously always pushing the limits, and that was
Walmart that was doing that. The Walmart in response to Amazon.
In response to Amazon.
Yeah.
Amazon. Yeah, this is it speaks directly to the point of senior leaders having to say, okay, we're going to have to relearn this. And that comes with pain and angst, and it puts leaders in an uncomfortable position, and it puts people on the ground in a position of uncertainty. But my broad sort of theory of the case here, as we try to lay out in Team of Teams a few years ago, and now with One Mission, is this isn't up to us anymore. Like, we are all trapped, whether we like it or not, in this transition into the information age, which we're collectively as a global society still on the front edge of. We think we're in the information age. We're just getting into it. Like, this is just starting to have its impacts. The one thing I can say with as much confidence as possible is, my kids are 6 and 8. When they're 30-year-old professionals, they won't work in organizations that function the same way that ours do today. Things are going to change. The question is, who gets there first, right? So I think what you just described is a great example of that interplay between established traditional competitors, new ideas and focus, and we're going to see massive shifts over the next 20 years to get us to whatever this is going to look like down the road.
Let me take you back to an historical example, military, for a moment, and connect it to Iraq. I'm just curious, and then I want to move into some other issues in One Mission. I said at the beginning here that I've had the chance, I'm in the States right now, but I've had the chance in the last 4 or 5 years to spend a lot of time in Saigon, Vietnam. You learn a lot, and you learn historically a lot of things that you don't necessarily hear when you're just in America. But I'm curious to compare the battlefield, and if you have in your training looked at that comparison, because what troops on the ground faced in Vietnam was surely something we had never really faced before. It was essentially a guerrilla war. You'd have, young kids in the middle of battle. You'd have, folks taking their uniforms off, putting the uniforms back on. Am I completely wrong to try and connect the dots a little bit between Vietnam and Iraq? And would that possibly have been the kind of the first for the American military, the first taste of this type of new battle?
No, I don't think it's a bad comparison. There's important differences, I think, to note. One being that the insurgents in Vietnam were much better than what we faced in Al Qaeda, as far as their ability to offer a legitimate alternative to the population, which is ultimately the goal of a good insurgent leader. Is I and my followers have this idea. The state has this other idea. You've been living under their idea for generations. And we think it's broken in the following ways. You're poor, your kids are sick and hungry and not poorly educated. We don't have a good economy, trade with neighboring countries, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my critique of the state. Here's how I plan to fix it. If the state finds me, they're going to kill me or arrest me. So I'm going to hide over here for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and build out my followers. And we're going to have secret meetings, and we're going to have a secret newspaper, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to be really talented and smart to be able to do that. That's why historically most insurgents were extremely bright people, high IQ and charismatic leaders who could create that sort of following, coupled with a literal life or death dedication to the cause, right? Because they would get their heads chopped off if the state discovered them too soon in that process. So those are really, really hard fighters. Now, take Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and couple the information age on top of it. I mean, the leadership of the Viet Cong was literally sitting in, dugouts with rotary phones and cables connecting each other. Give them the ability to interconnect in the information age, and Vietnam is a wholly different level of complex problem, right? When we entered today's fight, and what we saw with Al Qaeda in Iraq was, an offshoot of the original Al Qaeda central leadership. And they were a top-down structure. They still are to today in many ways, with bin Laden and Zawahiri up at the top, etc. But fast forward into Iraq, when Ayman al-Zawahiri shows up, AMZ as we call him, Jordanian-born, charismatic, psychopath leader of Al-Qaeda that took over the early days of the insurgency in Iraq. He wasn't an insurgent genius. He was a thug who realized, and his circle realized, we don't need to go hide in a cave for 20 years and build out an idea set. The idea is already there, which is a disenfranchised population, which is, there was a lot of validity to that argument. We just need to talk about it. And we have all this access to be able to spread these ideas very, very quickly. The only thing we want is for people to show up and be part of this fight. They were able to scale exponentially faster than a traditional insurgent might be able to. So going back 20 or 30 years. The downside of that was they didn't have to build out any sort of foundational idea with any real core stability like a traditional insurgent would have to. They weren't going to replace the state with some effective system had they overthrown the central leadership in Iraq and taken over the entire country.
Just chaos.
Just total chaos, yeah. Right. And so if that's your message, who are you going to attract? You're going to attract like-minded, chaotic, anarchist sort of insurgents who say, yep, I'm a zealot to this idea, and I'm willing to die for the cause, and we're just going to go create sheer chaos. And if you're a stable system like we were, like our partners in Iraq were, with the intent of providing something reasonable to the population, then you're dealing with scaled chaos, a giant flash mob that just wants to blow it all up. That's a tough fight. So I think that's a big differentiator that we're seeing nowadays.
That's a great point, great insights. Really, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about everything I've had a chance to learn over the years. I'm like, that's a really great perspective. Let me weave that into the broader issue of failure. So many of us don't want to fail at all, right? But many top minds out there know that there's a certain amount of failure that's to be expected because there's no way to really learn or improve unless you fail. There's no perfect linear straight line of success. But that's still not hard, especially when politics are involved and politicians are involved, and usually they only want to hear stories of perfection. But perfection and a lack of failure is just not how the real world works.
Yeah, and some of that ties back to what we were just talking about, and I think this is another reality of what all leaders are having to cope with in today's environment. So if you think of a military context, two traditional systems fighting each other. Think of World War II, for example. Not to oversimplify it too much, but you've got two like structured militaries fighting each other, and they face off. They draw lines across Europe, and they say, "This is your terrain, this is mine. I'm gonna invade, you're gonna defend, et cetera, et cetera." The way that they were running their organizations, plus or minus a few degrees, basically the same thing: top-down, traditional sort of bureaucratic structures, right? And they move on a similar timeline and how fast they can pass information up, make decisions, pass those down, et cetera. It was faster than maybe some industry was moving at that period in history, but not nearly as fast as the information age that we're in now, right? So you could go out, have a battle, take the lessons, they go through runners, they get escalated up to the top. People could clean that information up a little bit, and leaders could hear what they wanted to hear. I mean, we see that in industry all the time. This is how the boss likes to receive information. Don't tell the boss about that. He's going to get really upset. So there's folks in the middle that can clean it up, put fires out, take care of issues. If both sides are playing that game, then it works out fine. It's an even chessboard. What we found was playing like that and trying to clean up those daily failures that are bound to happen, protecting egos, keeping the boss away from information that he or she doesn't like to hear. That might work fine if everybody wants to feel like they're doing something effective, but in reality, you're going to lose very, very quickly. And we started to feel that. Like, we're playing this traditional game, and they're moving at light speed around us. We have to get comfortable identifying exactly what's happening in the moment, not just to our leadership, but to everybody. And so that means if something's working, highlight it. Why is it working? Build on it. If something isn't working, why isn't it working? Throw it away. Does somebody else have a lesson that they've tried and that has worked and made that thing work? Yes. Bolt it on. Let's try it. Still didn't work. Throw it away. That's real, honest, raw conversation that we had to be able to become comfortable doing that as an entire global enterprise. And that's a different leadership model. That the space where people can have those conversations in a traditional top-down sort of managerial model in a high-pressure situation, for us where lives are often on the line, only leaders can create the space where that's okay to do, where it's okay to say, all right, boss, since the last time we talked, here are the 3 things we tried. These 2 worked great. Here's why. We've already shared that with the other teams that can leverage it. Here's something that we thought was great, didn't work, and here's why. We're going to throw it away. We're going to work on it in this sort of fashion. That's honest and transparent communication. The leadership is the one that created the space to say, hey, bring me raw data. We used to kid around and call it naked leadership because our leaders would just step into the middle of this fray every 24 hours and accept new raw information from the field, stuff that they didn't know about yet. They would react to it. They'd think out loud about how they would interpret it. We would have a collective conversation, and then people would sprint again until the next time we resynchronized. But that allows not just failure, but a whole range of on-the-ground data to become shared like you would if it was you and I who started a company. It was just the 2 of us around the table. So we're just raw and transparent with each other every day. And then when we're 500 people, and that's really hard. McChrystal was doing that with 20,000 people around the globe. So getting down to that small team feeling at scale was the real challenge.
You mentioned that resynchronicity, getting together every day, and you're putting a time note on it. But that synchronicity, that gathering the new raw data and then synchronizing with leadership, that time component is compressing constantly, which I'm assuming the direction is leaving more and more decision-making with the individual, with less and less time to have leadership giving the go-ahead. Am I mistaken?
No, there's a few things that came into play in the way that our leadership started to run this task force that I was part of, and this evolved very organically over several years. Some of the key components that we looked at that you're describing here, one was sort of breaking that. We knew the traditional sort of the time periodicity of getting orders sent down and executing operations, et cetera. That was way too slow, right? So how do we get to that small team sort of rapid iteration cycle, right? The first thing that our senior leaders started to talk about, and I was too junior to be part of these conversations, but now being partnered with Stan McChrystal for many years now to reflect on what was going on at their level, they were early on in the fight, back to that early sort of chaos period that I described, saying to each other, how fast is this problem changing? Because what makes great teams great, and you see it in startup in tech, you see it on the sports field, you see it in the military, is they can see a problem and just intuitively adjust to it. People move, somebody throws a pass without thinking about it. All these things we've all been part of or witnessed. Well, how do you do that? That scale is the challenge. So they started to ask, how quickly is this Al-Qaeda problem readjusting itself? I gave you my example of literally watching it happen in real time. And they came up with the conclusion that it's an interconnected network without any centralized leadership that just reacts to changes in the environment, some of which we were the change in the environment based on the missions we were doing. So every day was the theory became every 24 hours, it's a new organization. It is shifted in some fundamental way that we need to readjust our operations toward. So we have to realign ourselves every 24 hours. So they started to look at the fight in these 24-hour increments and said, okay, if that's how we're going to do it, then we have to resynchronize as a team on that same scale. And our team is thousands of people around the globe. So we can't do this bureaucratic sort of cascading thing, meeting after meeting all the way down and into the ranks. So in these 24-hour cycles, the first 90 minutes of each of those windows was a global sync. It was a video teleconference that included 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people a day once it was, a few years into the process, that we called the Operations and Intelligence Update. That's not a new term in the military, but McChrystal started to leverage it not as a top-down direction sort of guidance process, and not as a sort of bottom-up, let me tell you what we did and sort of grade my homework, but more as a conversation, back to what you and I were just discussing. Here's what we've done. Here's what we think is working. Here's what we're unsure about. Here's what resources we might need. A very transparent, honest dialogue, right, between all these different critical components around the battlefield, and then thousands of people able to observe that, hear the real and raw data on the ground, hear the senior leadership interpret it, react to it, think about what it might mean in the strategy that we were implementing, all these other things. So everybody walked away with every single day. We did this 7 days a week for years on end with this sense of what we call shared consciousness, sort of this intuitive understanding, okay, we all see the problem the same way. And we know it's going to change in the next 22 hours. So in 22 hours, we'll be back right here. We'll realign ourselves again. We'll have the same conversation based on new data. And so each day we're going to walk out of this like we feel like we're a small team who's capable of that blind pass sort of operation. So that goes to your second point. That blind pass is that's that decentralized decision making. So that once the true shared consciousness started to develop within the task force, then those units closest to the ground could be granted higher and higher levels of autonomy, what we call empowered execution. So they had the ability to operate with real levels of autonomy during that 22-hour stretch. Now, different teams had different amounts of authorities that sat underneath their purview, and as you became more and more seasoned in that environment, you would gain more and more authorities. But the most seasoned teams who had been on multiple rotations and they're very valid leaders that had earned all their bona fides, they, minus one or two very strategic level, well, I have to call the president before you can do something like that, everything else sat at their level. So they could run with just speed and autonomy for these 22-hour windows, execute multiple operations without checking in and asking for permission. And then when we resynchronized, they would, okay, here's where we got, here's what the problem looks like right now. Let's not waste time talking about all these operations. Let's talk about the 3 or 4 things that we learned that tell us about what the problem looks like now, and then run again.
As I hear your story, I hear you put the details, put the flesh on bone. I'm thinking so many leaders in the military, and obviously Stan McChrystal was not one of them because he's inspired this movement, but so many leaders in the military you must have witnessed having their training, their entire lives set in motion by a certain style of thinking. Giving up control by leaders is not something they're used to. I mean, so giving up this control to to kind of a diffuse network and letting more people be a part of the decision making, there must have been, and I'm not asking for names, but there must have been leaders that you witnessed that could not adjust fast enough.
Yeah, at the time,
I mean,
sure.
I think clearly some leaders like McChrystal saw it, adjusted, and led right, and led the right way. But I'm sure some people, there must have been some friction where folks were like, "Hey, this isn't the way we're trained. We're not supposed to do it this way." Whereas someone like McChrystal was on the ground, he says, "You know what? We got to do it this way, or it's just there is no other way."
He used to jokingly, sort of jokingly, say to our organization, there's two types of people here, zealots or martyrs. It's up to you. Most people got it and just became zealots to change the culture of the organization. I honestly, there was sort of a natural reforming of personalities inside of the organization, but this didn't come down by decree on, Monday morning, and then by Tuesday we were a different organization. This was an evolution that took, probably 18 months to really start to ingrain itself, and then a few more years to refine and hit peak performance. During that window, there were certainly leaders at all different levels that said, "Hey, I'm going to sort of navigate this way now based on how we're running things. I'm not comfortable in this sort of role, but I'm comfortable over here." But there were probably there were probably a few examples of people just saying, "I'm out of here," or "This isn't working for this person. They have to move on." But honestly, that was very, very much in the minority. I think because it was such a collective conversation, everybody was invited to be part of the change. Like the only thing, and McChrystal told us from out of the gates, and he would say it openly to this day, which is what I knew we had to do was change. What I knew the problem was our old way of doing business didn't work anymore. And then I went out to the group and said, "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me we're winning right now, and I'll shut up." And nobody could prove that we were winning, and everything indicated to falling behind where we needed to be. So then he said, "Okay, well, let's change. What's change look like? What's working? Well, it works well when we communicate effectively. It works well when we trust each other. It works well when all these sort of cultural shifts that had to be put in place for this to be effective." Then people had the opportunity to contribute, and that's the core of any sort of effective change process. Is if you just come up with a good idea and tell me what to do, it's 50-50 whether I'm going to buy into it. But if you say, "Here's how I'm seeing the problem. Do you agree?" And I agree, and you say, "Let's change it together," I'm going to say, "Okay, I'm on your team. Let's do it." And most people, even the reticent ones that are comfortable with the old playbook, if they're really brought on to be part of this change process, and you're listening to my input and opinion, and I'm helping shape what we're going to become, well, then I'm one of your zealots. I'm on board.
For those of us that were not there, that don't have the military background, we hear the stories of McChrystal. We see the books, but that great example right there, that lets you see the inspiration firsthand.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's the challenge for leaders today. And I think we have far more that are capable of it than not. That's been my experience in working in industry now. But you can't do that through sort of quarterly report anymore. You can't do that through annual strategy. You have to do that through the willingness to step into the fray with your organization and say, "All right, team, here's what I'm seeing." And whether that's someone like a Doug McMillan, to your example, saying, "Hey, things are moving faster. We're going to try something radical here." That's in the middle of the team sort of leadership. That's not, "Well, we'll get together at the end of the year and look how delivery is taking place." That's courage and brave leadership and getting in the middle of the issue that organizations are wrestling with.
Hey, Chris, one last nugget before I let you run. I saw this line. I think I'm paraphrasing a little. You can give me some of the genesis of it. Treat everyone on the battlefield like they are your mother. I love that. Explain that for the audience.
Well, and that's maybe back to the earlier conversation. That's kind of often counterintuitive for people that haven't been in these environments. But I've never fought in conventional conflict, but I imagine there are some similarities. But especially in the conflicts that we're faced with today, you are bringing together diverse teams, so military, civilian, coalition partners from other nations, our host nation partners in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, civilian populations that you're literally fighting wars in their backyard, political dynamics both in the U.S. It's three-dimensional complexity, right? To pull all these things together. Again, there's no order you can write to make all that work. That is all about developing relationships, and relationships are grounded in understanding the other actor's perspective on the fight, and going into that conversation in the back of your mind, acknowledging to yourself, what I'm going to hear from this person might run counter to 80% of my viewpoint, and it might be just as valid as my perspective. So we have to be willing to have a conversation that says, I see it differently than you see it differently than me, and from our vantage points, both of us could be right in this environment. So how do we solve for that? And then we're only going to solve for that if I trust you. If I trust you to say, okay, you know what? For right now, you have the lead, and I'm going to trust that your perspective is better on this. Add that up over, multiple layers and all these different players that have to come in and multiple dimensions that are involved. You can see where this idea of treat everybody like your mother, show the respect and courtesy that you would extend to your own family in these sorts of environments. And if you're always the one leading with that perspective, that's naturally, as it should be, it's naturally disarming. It can come with great personal pain and headaches at some points, because if you're always the first mover in that relationship, which I saw McChrystal do this to great ends. We had come into these conflicts, the task force being sort of the best equipped, best trained, most secretive parts of the U.S. military. And he immediately flipped that and said, hey, we are going to be the givers in this relationship. And we will give you information. We will give you resources. We will give you whatever you need to accomplish your mission. And we will be supporting to all of that, which was very, very counterintuitive to all these other partners. And over time, it happened quicker than you would think, but not overnight. They started to say, well, we're going to trust these guys because they've never asked for anything from us, and they're constantly trying to understand our perspective. Then you can build real trust-based relationships. You can start to speed up things on how you move information and make decisions. Ultimately, all those different actors can get comfortable with the decentralization that McChrystal was trying to put into the task force specifically, so that one of our units is going from A to B to C inside of this threat network very, very quickly. Those other actors can say, well, from their perspective, what they're seeing right now is probably the best vantage point. So let's trust them to do what they need to do, and then I know they'll inform us later when it's all done.
And that simple heuristic, mom equals trust, an easy message to get across to everybody.
Exactly right.
The book, One Mission, How Leaders Build a Team of Teams. Chris, best of luck with the book. And I should note a forward that everybody wants, a forward by General Stanley McChrystal. So that's best of luck with everything. Hey, is there a best website we can send people to check you out, check out more information?
Yeah, if they go to mcchrystalgroup.com, you can check out our advisory services work that we do. The book's on there. The book's obviously on Amazon and all the other big distributors as well. So I hope folks that pick it up enjoy it. And I'd love to hear their thoughts as they get through it.
Chris, thank you for taking the time today. I look forward to book number 3, sure to come.
That's right, sure to come. I appreciate the time. Thanks.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.